So welcome everyone. We are Relationships and Astrology, aside from Kelsey, who couldn't be with us because of the time difference in Australia. And we're delighted to see you all. And really tonight kind of came about from a conversation we were having about, how tired everyone is. And then others saying, well, actually, we're not just tired, we're also kind of really wired. And that was really how the title came about. And we started thinking, gosh, with Jupiter squaring Uranus and Saturn squaring Uranus, there's a lot happening. So we thought, what if we just looked at the next few weeks, kind of really into, was it February we said, Christopher, we were kind of thinking of, I think it was February,
Sure.
to see what's going on for us in terms of relationships. How does this really impact us within the context also of being, a lot of us in COVID lockdowns. So either we're on our own, or which has some kind of repercussions, or we're with spouses or partners, or we're with housemates and friends and children and all the complications, and dogs and cats and everything like that. So we thought, let's explore this a little bit as a discussion. Rachel, I'm going to hand it right over to you.
Okay. Well, and I wanted to also say that if anyone has questions, that the chat is open, and I'll be watching the chat throughout this whole thing. So, so please feel free to ask questions. We're going to keep everybody on mute just so that we don't have a lot of interference. But if you have questions and you want to raise your hand, I'll be keeping an eye out for those things. So let's start with just talking about, I think actually Christopher, in our discussions you were talking about sleep and about how people are feeling tired or people are feeling wired. And so maybe we could just go around and talk a little bit about why people might be experiencing this in their daily habits, like how they might be experiencing this Uranian energy.
Sure. Well, if you don't mind, I'll jump on in. I think it's kind of natural to sort of sleep or rest at this time of year. I think hibernation is something that's kind of hardwired into the animal species, and I don't think that we're exempt from it. But I think that with so much information overload that's going on, whether it's coming through social media or television or friends or your iPhone, there's just such, I think, a bombardment. And what's interesting about that is that I think over the past few years, we kind of think that we've adjusted to it, that we can multi-platform our mind, or we can multi-platform our attention span, but I think that when it takes on a much more dire kind of flavor, even if it's being repackaged or repeated over and over and over again, I think there's a kind of fatigue that sets in. On one hand, we're like, what are the election results going to be, or what's going on with COVID, or what, it's almost like at every 15 minutes there's a new thing that you have to, it comes over Twitter or Instagram or something like that you have to respond to. So we're still kind of like in this physical response thing. But I think that as the information has become more potentially disruptive or disturbing, I think that there's a wear and tear. Or I was wondering if other people might have been feeling this as well, this kind of like wear and tear, but yet there's still another part of your mind which is like, what's the next thing? And so it's almost like the consciousness is moving in two different directions. One is kind of like, I have to respond to a like, or I have to respond to, and then, in the background, the unconscious is like, I have to like go to sleep. I have to absorb this. I have to recover from all of this. So I was wondering whether other people were having this kind of like experience of almost like the consciousness moving in two different directions. One rushing ahead to like push a button or find out more about something, and then another just like, I have to retire. I have to retreat. I have to absorb what I'm taking in.
I'd like to respond to that to some degree, Christopher. I think it's really interesting what you're bringing up, because it matches a lot of what I'm seeing in my caseload and working with my clients as well. And that is that, the Uranus principle is an activation of the cosmic mind into the psyche of the collective, of the human experience. And it's very, very intense. And at the level that we're seeing, because we're also getting all of this other chatter with the planetary energies of the Saturn, Jupiter, you know, gosh, go on, Venus too, and they're a little bit lighter. But
Right.
we bring in such a heightened activation, and part of the human species when we are overstimulated is to need to go down into sleep and that hibernatory state. And we can't, because we're also on such high alert with particularly that Mars square Saturn within the Uranus dynamic. So I think you're bringing up an important point. There's a big activation happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like your phrase, Yvonne, of high alert, like high alert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
think also, sorry, Rachel,
no,
I was
no,
just
go ahead, Margaret.
you know, also I think there's that shift in energy, which has been pretty dramatic from the Jupiter Saturn in Capricorn to the Jupiter Saturn in Aquarius. And I think that that shift from an energy which felt heavy and like we were all anchored down and weighed down, and there was so much about duty and commitment to each other, to our families, to our work, to suddenly what felt like suddenly that shift into Aquarius, which has such a very, very different feel about it and is, of course, Uranian. And I think that, you know, we haven't really had, I know for myself and talking to clients, there hasn't been a lot of time to adjust almost to that shift. And so we're still dealing with all the collective chaos. I mean, for us here in Ireland, we've got Brexit next door, you know, so,
Right.
and yet, the energies are almost wanting us to go faster and to be more innovative or whatever. And we're still kind of dealing with what's gone on the past year. And when you think about that in terms of relationships, if there's several people in a house, you've got different people with their own experiences that are dealing with that, not to mention whatever you know, phase they're in. They could be going through midlife transits as well, or Saturn returns, and then you've got adolescents, and then you've got younger children. So there's a multitude of forces coming together in an extraordinary way.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that I want to piggyback off of what you just said, Margaret, is that Uranus is space. It's the sky. It's the heavens. And Saturn is time. And so one of the things that has been a big theme for us is the way that we're experiencing time and space. You know, how many of us have seen those memes and those posts that are like, is it, you know, it's March, March 2020 here in January 2021. Like our sense of time is foggy. Like, what day is it? We're all doing the, you know, we're at home, we're on Zoom. But this is affecting us in our homes too, because we're sharing spaces. We're now in like these small containers with one another. And this is having a really big impact on relationships, to where most of our lives are taking place digitally. We're not going out into the world. And so, I recognize that in some places, we're still more on lockdown than other places, but our lives are happening more virtually now. And so what's also interesting too, I think, is that if we look at the mythology of Uranus, you know, Uranus is born of Gaia. And Uranus is transiting, Uranus is in Taurus. So there's this real interesting dynamic going on between the need to ground and the need to center. And I think maybe that's what sleep is doing for us. And also the desire, or the way that culture and all these transits are kind of pulling us out of the earth and into the heavens. So there's like this, there are so many different ways that consciousness is shifting as a result of some of these transits right now.
By far.
I think also, you know, that brings up the whole issue of our moons, how our moons are feeling. When you think that the moon is so important in relationships in terms of that interaction, that emotional vulnerability and emotional intimacy, our moons get shaken fairly easily, depending, of course, where the moon is in the aspects. But for most of us, you know, somehow it can get shaken. So I think it's our lunar cycles that are getting shaken up, you know, particularly, and that may be the issue with sleep as well, that we're out of sync, our bodies, because we're spending more time at a computer or indoors. I mean, I'm noticing it's like, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what time is it of the day or night? Whereas before I was going out to see clients in an office and being outdoors. So that's really affecting all of our rhythms, all of that natural ebb and flow.
You know, it's really interesting that, we're two very polite people. Results. So it's interesting that, you know, in modern society, we've moved so much away from the natural rhythms of, like, you know, what's a long day? Well, you know, like, what's a short day in terms of the sun's position? And I mean, even weather doesn't matter that much in so many ways, you know, whether it's raining or so on. And because we have air conditioned environment. And so we really, you know, we know that over the course of decades, we've moved so far away from, like, the natural rhythm type of thing. And it's really odd that now that we're not going anyplace, now that we're all home, it's sort of an opportunity to readjust to and become more aware of those things. And yet we're probably not really doing that at all very much. I mean, I know that, you know, definitely you have a lot of opportunities to, say, you know, notice when the sun sets and stuff like that, because, you know, I mean, I'm sitting in the living room every day when it happens. So I notice that there's a difference to it. But it's funny how we've moved from one disconnected sort of time frame into another one with the natural rhythm sort of behind it all, and not necessarily getting that much attention.
Mm-hmm. What I would like to also piggyback on with Rachel was the whole notion of time, and also to address cycles with Armando and Margaret. What I think, you know, it's the phrase amused me when it first emerged a few years ago, but now it's like seems much more prevalent. But this phrase real time, you know, I mean, like, you'll see newscasters say, this is happening in real time. And, you know, it makes you want to ask, well, what other time is there? Is there like FACO time or something, or alternative time? But, you know, this whole, I mean, they'll really introduce things really quite matter-of-factly and seriously with this idea of real time.
Well, Uranus does change time.
If I can just, but I want to sort of introduce as an image or an idea, is that Saturn we're pretty much familiar with is the god of time. But what sometimes we're not always familiar with is that there's a period where Saturn eats his children, you know, he consumes his children. And in the Roman understanding of this was called the Golden Age, because what had happened is that by Saturn consuming his children, time had stood still. And so it was actually regarded as a golden age when everything was plentiful and everything was available. You can read it in Ovid Metamorphoses. And so what's kind of fascinating about that is Saturn is not only the god of time, but he's the god of timeless places. Where things freeze or stop, like, for instance, Shangri-La or El Dorado or Brigadoon. You know, so this notion of being of time stopping, which I think we really are kind of like talking about here, and then also the question of cycles. It's just an image or an idea that I wanted to introduce.
Definitely. I think it's an important one, Christopher, because I'm thinking in terms of, you know, the Saturn Uranus itself has many implications, but one of them that shows up when we study the concept of synchronicity, the idea of meaningful coincidences. We see this happening in many people's charts that have a lot of synchronistic phenomena, including Carl Jung, who was the kind of father of coining the idea of synchronicity, that we have these moments in time of things happening that have many kind of a larger collective. And again, we're talking about sort of freezing in the moment of time in the way that Saturn can do that, a kind of cosmic mind input. We have a bigger perspective. We understand things linking up on a much broader scale in a collective form. So it's a very interesting time for us to be in. And it causes a lot of disturbance in the way that, Margaret, you were saying with the issue around sleep, as you too, Christopher.
Yeah.
I think the issue of sleep, also connects, you know, when you think about relationships and, you know, if we're sleeping or sharing a bed with somebody, or we're just interacting with them on a daily basis, if our moon is out of sync and is being disturbed, then emotionally it's not so easy to connect with that other person. And it's not so easy to create bridges of understanding between us and them, because that ability to do that gets kind of eroded. And I think that's something to look out for, you know, this certainly the first half of this year is, you know, how are these energies really affecting intimate relationships, whether they're with family members, whether they're with their children, because also parent-child relationships, it's back to the moon, or grandparents, you know, and there's, of course, a lot around COVID in terms of protecting the elderly, protecting aged parents, and so on. So all of that is being really kind of, it feels like it's been thrown into a blender, really, and kind of we don't quite know what's going to come out because of these forces. But I think if we're aware of them in relationships, it can help us maybe just take a breath or take a step back when we can feel that, you know, we're just not coping, or even to be able to say, look, I'm just not coping. This has nothing to do with you.
Mm-hmm. So Margaret, are you talking about cycles with the moon, or are you talking about emotional comfort zone with the moon?
I'm talking really about emotional comfort, you know, that I think when Uranian energy intrudes on the lunar emotional bodily energy, then it really throws us out of kilter. You know, I remember years ago, Melanie Reinhardt, I think, talked about Uranian energy as like, you know, you've got your fingers in a plug, an electric socket. And I think with Jupiter squaring Uranus, it's enhancing that energy. And even though it's Uranus in Taurus and no longer in Aries, which was really hiked beyond the beyonds, but it's still, that's even more so disrupting that lunar realm, and also the Venusian realm, of course.
It's kind of interesting because Uranus and the moon are both so associated with cycles. You know, I mean, you know, we think of them as being very different types of energies, but they're actually pretty similar in their going back to the beginning to start again. You know, I mean, Mars is shooting out, or Venus is joining or inviting, and Jupiter could be enveloping, you know, but Uranus is like a wheel. I mean, it's the only planet that orbits the sun on its side. Its north and south poles are where everybody's equators are, you know, so it literally is this wheel in the sky that keeps on turning. So the whole notion of this wheel, you know, coming back to the beginning, like what's the beginning, what's the end, but that's also kind of emulated with the moon. So I just kind of think it's interesting that for two planets that we don't think of as maybe being organically connected to each other, that there's actually a very sort of similarity when we think of them in astrology.
Yeah.
And they're both about relating.
Yeah, and actually even our physical bodies, because Uranus is the ruler of the pituitary gland, and the co-ruler of the pineal gland. And the pituitary gland is what gets our cycles going and what like facilitates moon's functions in reproduction. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
You just intuited it, Christopher.
Armand, I was going to go back to something you said that I thought was funny when we were first talking about this the other day, Armand, about, you know, how roommates could be cellmates at the moment. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. It just kind of tickled me.
I think you said that.
No, I didn't say that. I did not say that. No.
Sounds awfully clever. It is a little bit like that. Well, you know, isn't that a funny thing though? We're all sort of isolated with the whole COVID thing, and then there's some people that actually are around you, and some, geez, go away. Just, and sometimes you don't even like, you know, also too, you don't say want to pick up the phone or something like that too. It's like, you know, I think we're all very much on our own time thing right now. It's like, you know, it's funny, but when I was busier or out more or whatever that was before COVID, I'm not quite sure anymore. But whatever, but you know, I found a lot more time for connecting with people, and now it's like, well, you know, I'm grouting the tile. Just don't talk to me. Today is off the table, and that is, you know, it is a very Uranian kind of thing. You know, what something I know you were saying is like boundaries. You know, we put up a lot of boundaries, and so that's a pretty healthy thing at this point in time. You know, obviously making it work in a healthy way is a challenge, but I think that, like, you know, a little bit of that kind of thing of knowing that, okay, you know, you need to put up boundaries too.
Mhm.
or reinvent them. I mean, because we're reinventing time. I mean,
Exactly.
this is going to be affecting the way your role in society, whether you go out or go in. It's going to be affecting your to-do list, which has nothing to do with your lunar cycles. Dream is when you drop out of time. You know, no one keeps time in their dreams. You know, there's a sense of like timelessness. You know, when you're awake, there are these associations that you should be producing. I know that there were a lot of guilt trip memes or whatever that were going around last year of like, you know, with all this time on my hands, I should be producing more or whatever. And it was like, why am I like doing nothing but streaming Netflix? So, you know, I think it's really, it's come into our homes. It's absolutely affecting relationships, but relationships are also geared to how you present yourself into the world as well. You know, is someone still the breadwinner? You know, were you working a profession that you can't work in right now because the restaurants are closed or something along those lines? So how does that do in the home? Are you living by yourself? How is that affecting, you know, your relationship to people outside of the home versus your home and in the space? So it's really been this extraordinary examination of our private lives, but because we're all digitally connected in a strangely public way.
Mhm.
Well, I feel like, you know, when we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction last January, it was
Mm.
kind of a period of really being stripped bare as well. That Pluto, you know, has been digging up ever since he's been in Capricorn. He's been digging up under the surface. And I think that back to the Capricornian energy, we were all in isolation, literally. And I think we had to deal with ourselves. We had to get to know ourselves. We had to, and get to know also, if in a relationship with somebody, our significant other, in a very different way, because there wasn't the external distractions that are there that take away, or in a family, to get to know each person in that family. So we were kind of locked down literally into that, and into having to, it's like, well, you know, if you're with somebody 24/7, there are very few secrets left. And there's, you know, I mean, yes, you can have boundaries, but they're still not the same. You know, you get to know somebody pretty well. And I think that's continuing now, but also then expanding with the Uranian energy, so that in a way it's almost like, okay, that process is still ongoing, yet we're also expected to be a little more external now.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Uranian energy, what about this idea? I mean, we connect Uranus to awakening, right? You know,
Right.
but what about this idea that awakening has become, I don't know, politicized? I mean,
By far.
you know, what does that mean, and how does that register in relationships?
Well, things are that, you know, it's kind of like the lid's been ripped off on so many levels for us, at least here in the United States, as we watch what's happening in our political system. And we also have then to contend with what the people close to us feel about what's happening. And some things are very surprising, as we are learning in, you know, currently. And so, you know, it's sort of how do we be with all of that in a way that both is curious and allows for that expression, and then also looks to what we need to maintain in terms of keeping things sort of the way moving forward in a form of growth. And that's the challenge here, because Uranus does not really, as an archetype itself, is not just oriented toward growth, it's oriented toward breaking through.
Right.
So, you know, we've got a lot of plates to spin.
Right.
Do you all think that how do you think this square, the Saturn Uranus square, is going to play out in terms of this, in terms of polarization within relationships, polarization within families? What insights do you have about that?
Well, I think it's interesting that in the way that I work as an astrologer, I work with Saturn and Uranus as being the co-rulers of Aquarius.
Mhm.
And so that's the way that I work with them. And I think it's really quite fascinating that Uranus is presenting itself or appearing in a sign which is actually more connected to being traditional. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. and maintain the stability and hold the turf, you know. So Uranus is actually in a surprise, in a sign that we might find surprising. You know, it's like, you know, Uranus is supposed to be progressive or moving forward or enlightenment, or, you know, but here it's in Taurus. So we're learning these things about Taurus, okay? And then Saturn, which is supposed to be the more, you know, riding the brake and, you know, demanding structures and discipline and things like that, is appearing in a sign which is popularly associated with being more independent thinking or progressive in attitude. So I just sort of wanted to introduce it as an idea, but I think the notion that these two planets have kind of like switched places with themselves, like in a sort of capture the flag sort of way or something.
Right.
You know, one is over here and like, I'm in the more progressive, you know, and one is over here and like, I'm in the more, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, you know, but yet, you know, it's not the way we're accustomed to thinking about them.
And Marcia just reminded us, and so we'll remind everybody, that Uranus turns direct today, that it's stationed. Today is the station. So I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you're saying, Christopher. You know, it's kind of like the Saturn with the Mars squaring Uranus, at least right now. There's this kind of like, the tendency is to kind of curb it's like a consistent effort to curb the volatility that of those typically Uranian energies. But like you're saying, they're in almost like signs out of sign, you know, with the
Right.
Uranus in, you know, and so I think part of what's happening is the inability to function at its highest level, these planetary energies, because they are in these different signs that kind of force different adjustments. So there's a lot of adjusting having to happen, it feels like. And I hear that in the work that I do with people.
I think there's also a lot of, sorry, Christopher, I was going to say there's a lot of polarizations. And I think it's, you know, this has been going on for a while. And of course, you know, it's exploding all over the place. I mean, you know, closer to home for me, there's the whole Brexit issue in the UK and the polarization over that and over the decisions, every little decision, you know, whether it's the fishing in the sea or whether, you know, for us, it's the border in Northern Ireland. So I think it's like, you know, as humans, we want to connect. Naturally, we try to connect, and yet we're actually bringing up these polarizations that have always been there, really underground, are all coming up, and they're coming up very fast. And so that can create quite a lot of stress, I think, in dynamics, even with friendships or with family members. And, you know, I can't remember, somebody said, you know, what happens when we actually don't want to create a bridge, or when, you know, a bridge isn't feasible, or when we don't want to stretch out, you know, that far to kind of, you know, give an olive branch or whatever. And what happens then? You know, so I think that's something that's kind of very, there's a volatility about it. There's an explosiveness about it. And I think anyway, with Uranus and Taurus, you know, it's challenging our basic security, and relationships are one of our ways of feeling secure. It's also challenging us financially. And of course, there's going to be financial challenges over the next while or so. And that's going to impact all our relationships, you know, on lots of different levels. So there's so many balls we're trying to juggle.
What I think is interesting about what you just said is that you're talking about polarization, Margaret, right? But if you look at the planets, they're not in opposite signs.
I was just going to say that, Christopher.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay,
No, you're good. You're good. Keep going. I'll add to what you're saying.
But the thing is, and the difference between an opposition and a square is that when two planets are opposed, they can just leave the argument altogether. They don't have to have a discussion at all. You know, they don't have to balance each other's energies. They don't have to understand each other. They're at polar opposites. Someone opposite in this, you on the seesaw doesn't have to like be on your side. In fact, you know, but the thing is, we're dealing with squares, which are combative and collaborative by nature, you know, so it's forcing us to seek a fit, even if we don't. I mean, Uranus and Taurus is going to force Taurus forward, whether it wants to go, it's going to redistrict Taurus, whether it wants to be redistricted or not. You know, that's what Uranus is going to do. And then Saturn with Aquarius, I don't know. Rachel, back to you.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love where you're going with this. Also, squares tend to have a Saturnine quality to them. You know, they want stability, they want structure. A square introduces tension for the purpose of growth. So it's not just argument for the sake of argument. It's an opportunity for us to come together on, you know, Taurus and Aquarius themes within our relationships. So this would be our values, our finances, our community, our friends, how we're spending our time, the dreams that we have, the visions that we have for the future. And I think, you know, the growth that we're talking about isn't necessarily growth. It can, I mean, Uranian energy can be erratic. It can be, I've got to get out of this relationship, and this is how we grow together, is one of us leaves. But because these are both fixed signs, I think the inclination is going to be more like, let's dig in and let's figure out how to make this work.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's a need for more integrative and process when you have a square. You're going to have to work it out.
Yeah, it's almost like you've gotten caught on someone's button in the elevator, you know, and you're trying to get out and the person's following you, and you have to like sort of like stop and work out how you're going to unconnect, you know. So what's combative actually has to become collaborative, you know, in a square. They're not allowed to just sort of walk away. And I think someone just asked, doesn't the outer planet always win? Well, in a square, there's a battle for supremacy. So either planet can win. If an outer planet's in a Mercury ruled sign and it's squaring Mercury, guess what? Mercury has an upper hand with that, even though one would think that the outer planet is more powerful by Mercury ruling the sign that the outer planet is in. So, you know, these.
Well, Jupiter is going to enhance it. You know, even though it's a square, the Jupiterian energy is going to enhance. And I think that's the, you know, the point we're coming up on the 17th, of course, the Jupiter square Uranus. And I think that's something that feels a little more volatile. You know, I think the Saturn square Uranus feels more about manifesting something, about creating something. So I think in a way there's a little bit more potential, but we've only got the one square from Jupiter, but I think that's a point at which, you know, things can just get so big and just so, there's just that tension around that I think is much harder to integrate, because in a way it's almost like, you know, Jupiter, Zeus and Prometheus, they had a challenging relationship. I mean, Prometheus stole fire from the gods and Zeus wasn't very happy and punished him. So there's that interesting relationship because they're in competition with each other, but together things get bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's certainly a day to be a little watchful in relationships about how dynamics go in all relationships, you know, including work relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps to also remember that Jupiter is, the planet is named after a god that was famous for integrating. Okay, it's the only god that produces new gods from its own body. You know, it doesn't produce them through coupling or whatever. And it's also kind of interesting, you know, that they're transgender gods. But anyway, you know, that Athena is produced from the head, Dionysus from the thigh. And so it is the nature of Jupiter to expand in order to include or to integrate. One of the things that was associated with Zeus in ancient Greece was weaving of tapestry, you know, taking the disparate strands and weaving them together. You see that in Zeus's daughter, Athena or Minerva, being the goddess of weaving tapestry. She has a famous contest with someone and turns her into a spider. But, you know, that idea of weaving in disparate threads is very Jupiterian. And so what's kind of interesting, what's very interesting, what you're bringing up, Margaret, is that we think of Uranus as bursting out of this, but it's the Jupiter energy that's going to try to reach out or to weave in or to integrate. That's the nature of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting perspective on Zeus. I often think of him as kind of arrogant and unfaithful, but I may have to revise. I like that view of kind of him as integrating. I never kind of thought of it from that perspective. So thank you.
Well, actually, the body of Christ, the whole notion of body of Christ is from Zeus. It's the whole notion of living within the body of the god, because Zeus was the god of the polis, or the city state. And so that was the body politic. So those notions of being part of a body, or communion, of working for the good of others in society, are essentially Jupiterian in nature.
Mhm.
And that relates to a question we have, actually. This is really all synchronistic. But the question is that that this is another family constellation. In 2020, we had Kronos dealing with his sons, Zeus and Hades, and now he's dealing with his father. And Kronos castrated his father. So that's anyone wanted to speak to that, family constellation and potential opportunities that represents?
Quick art history moment here. In French, oh, what do they call them? It's French, it's not lithograph, but it's, the tradition was that Zeus in turn castrates his father Saturn. That's why in the medieval symbolism, you see Saturn on a crutch, and you know, wearing kind of like a tunic or whatever in front, because he himself has been castrated by Zeus. So there was a lot of, for the Freudians in the audience, there's a lot of castrating going on.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of depotating the power, which, you know, is interesting. We're dealing with an impeachment here in the United States. So we definitely have that going on, right?
Well, it's talking about generations, right? I mean, if we're going to take in the families, we're talking about the 3 generations. And it's fascinating because in that same Ovid piece that I was sort of paraphrasing earlier, after Saturn, you know, swallows the children, and Zeus comes and forces his father to throw up, to vomit out the children so they can live
Right.
again. Zeus sets up his new regime. We went from golden age to silver, and the Roman poet makes a comment saying less than. We went to something that was less than, that once.
Then don't we go to iron after that? I mean, it's like,
exactly.
it's sort of a downward, we have to go down first.
Which is the way that maybe some generations, you know, I mean, older generations seem to look at younger ones and say, oh, God, you know, in my day and age, I was smarter than that. I was quicker than that. I was more able to do this or that. And then the younger generation has this very sort of Jupiterian, like, overthrow the old guy, you're getting in the way, it's your old structures or whatever that have got to go. So we're kind of seeing these generational, you know, it's always been there, but it's actually very much clashing right now, you know.
By far.
Yeah. It's in line with this thinking. I've been seeing in my client practice and just looking at these transits, that power struggles in relationships and power struggles in the collective as well are things that might be up for us, like who certain people saying that they don't have a voice, other people saying they don't have a voice, and everybody trying to find a voice. I was wondering if you wanted to speak to that and speak to that in particular in relationships. And Armand, I think actually in our talk, I think you brought up something about this as well, with regard to this in relationships. So maybe you could start us out.
Oh gosh, I keep coming back to things that I said in the past. That I just say a lot of stuff. I mean, I'm glad it catches with somebody, but you can't expect me to remember it. The about power dynamics in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that this is a time when they're really quite acute, of course. I think a lot of what's happening, you know, with regard to what everybody said before, and I think Margaret made this point, a lot of things have already been there. You know, a lot of this stuff is not really new. It's just surfacing, and it's surfacing at the same time, which makes it in a way much more difficult. You know, there is very much the feel like everybody feels that they don't have a voice, you know, which is really odd at a time when we've just kind of gotten used to the idea that everybody has a voice. Everybody is out there, tweeting and stuff like that and saying what's on their mind. And so in the sort of Aquarian sense, everybody has a voice. And then, but no, maybe it's not that you don't have a voice. It's the feeling that people don't have a power behind their voice. It used to be that a few people had a voice and it had power behind it. Now everybody has a voice, but the power has kind of dissipated and diluted. So you can say whatever you want to say, and 15 people will like it, but what does that really do? And I think that's a real struggle that we have, and that is a very Aquarian thing. Everybody has an equal voice, but everybody also has equal power, and as such, it's not too much. Well, you shouldn't have called on me if you didn't.
I was kind of laughing to myself, just a little quip, thinking not everybody has a voice on Twitter anymore. That's all I'll say. So.
Yeah. I was also going to add too. Oh, go ahead, Margaret. You were on something.
Not at all. That was all.
If you want to talk about taking away the power and stuff, like we talked about the castration before, it's not the impeachment. It's the loss of the Twitter account.
It's true. I it depends on the perspective, but definitely he would feel that castration through the loss of Twitter. But I was also going to say, just with our, that everybody has a voice in some way within the social media world, there is also then the tendency to acquire more power by messaging information that allows you to have more attention. That not necessarily adds to the conversation. It can inflame, it can put you at the top, but it also can corrode. And so this sort of responsibility towards one's kind of input into the world has some need to be addressed. And I think in some ways the Saturn Uranus, with the technology that Uranus carries, and Saturn is sort of the role of responsibility and sort of maturity, is sort of working towards that form, which hopefully will go well. But it's up in the air right now as we look at different ways that they're going to be addressing some of the social media functions in our world these days.
Rachel, you'd said something as well interesting about marginalized groups. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think I think when we're talking about this matter of boundaries, and we're talking about this matter of voice and power and all of these things, one of the opportunities I think we have right now is for people who've been marginalized to realize their own power within, that it's not actually it doesn't have to anymore come from the government or religion or these social structures, that actually everybody has the ability to experience their own inner authority and find a way to express that out into the world. And so I think that that's going to be really significant. And one of the ways that that's going to translate into changes in relationships is the balance of power within masculine feminine dynamics, and even the way that we bring our awareness of gender and our understanding of gender outside of those heteronormative paradigms. So I think that that's something that we're going to see a lot more of this year.
And I think that's also going to translate into the astrology, because a lot of the astrology of relationships is based on, sun is man, moon is woman, Venus is woman, Mars is man, all of that. And although I know there are lots of astrologers, including you, Christopher and Rachel, who are challenging all of that, in terms of your talks and your lectures and your writing, but I think there's still, it's very hard. We still all come up against that, and I was writing something the other day and I realized that, oh my goodness, it's so easy to fall into that. And I think that's really going to change. That's my hope, that is all going to change. And people are really, because younger generations are already challenging all of that. They just don't see what the big issue is. But I think for older generations, it's taking a little bit of adjustment. There's a resistance to that, and a resistance to the old roles, to what those mean. And so we're in for enormous changes. I mean, really. And I remember looking back to when Uranus was in Taurus before, And that was World War II and the changing role of women within that. And that women were finally free of that stereotype of just being behind the kitchen sink. But what happened after the war was the attempt to bring them right back in there. So they weren't paid the same as men for being in jobs out there, or they were expected to go back to the women's roles and so on. So I think Uranus in Taurus really does challenge those stereotypes as well, which goes very well with the Aquarian energy, that the two together could be quite formidable in finally breaking free of some of those stereotypes, which keep both genders completely trapped, really.
By far.
I would also like to add would be race. I
Yes.
think
Yes.
with Uranus upsetting Taurus, there's redistricting that's taking place. We saw it dramatically here in the United States. We saw it dramatically with the elections in Georgia, and how the African-American community, which had endured decades of having the voice taken away through voting, through election, now expressing it and affirming it was very, very powerful. And I think that, I think one of the big things that's emerging that isn't Aquarius, but it may be a new way of looking at Aquarius, is that, I don't know about you guys, but, when I was reading Linda Goodman growing up and those old, coffee table books of astrology and things like that, Aquarius was supposed to be Age of Aquarius and expanded consciousness and it almost seemed to produce in my imagination a neutered utopia. It was a utopia that was just sort of like blank and white. It was just kind of like this blank white slate of equality, one size fits all type of thing or whatever. And growing up in the 60s, I'm dating myself, but growing up in the 60s, I remember late 60s, early 70s, there was a popular phrase which was incredibly insulting, which was, I don't have any colored friends, I just have friends. And it was just so remarkably condescending and so remarkably off thinking. And I think that what we're kind of experiencing now that we truly are moving into what may at last be the age of Aquarius in the next 200 years with our cycles going through the air trigon, this understanding that there may be a tendency in the Aquarian to blank out, to make all equal so that nothing individual, Leo, is identified, and that what we're experiencing almost right off the bat is, no, not everyone's on the same page. No, not everyone is enjoying the same advantages. No, no, institutions may not be who decides who gets a voice or not, and I was reading in the New Yorker the other day that we seem to be at this point where in the history of the United States, sorry, we're being very American-centric tonight, but in the history of the United States, we're actually moving from a slave-owning country into actually a true democracy. Like, this is the point where this may be it, and then what that does for everything in terms of race and economy and gender, it's all going to affect people in their own lives. It's going to redistrict, Uranus and Taurus, it's going to redistrict communities and alliances. And so that's where I think, perhaps it's a bit more global. I got Aquarian, I apologize, but it's a bit more global than, one-on-one relationships. But I think that that's absolutely a part, playing a piece in this overall arc.
Well, I think that there's a real dark side to every side, and Aquarius certainly has one too. And it is very much what you're saying. It can blank out the differences and so on. It can be very principled, but to the point of being intolerant, and that's a problem with Saturn. And Saturn gets out of Aquarius 2 weeks later. The other fellow, Pluto, gets into it. And so, we're going to have, some real, we'll be really dealing with both sides of Aquarius. And the whole thing about the age of Aquarius, and it was a great song, don't get me wrong, but it may have increased the level of optimism about the age of Aquarius beyond reason. We have some real challenges. If you look at every time Saturn is in Aquarius, you get these movements that come up. And you also get the resistance to them. And I think that's one of the things that astrology is really helpful for. And we're talking about the square between Saturn and Uranus. I think that the direction of change, to the extent that you can sort of suss out what it is one thing. And then we can look at something like the square and go, well, how much resistance are we going to get? You know, that's the thing, you know, we're going to go in this direction eventually, but exactly, you know, what's it going to cost? And sometimes it costs a lot.
Well, that's the hard part of integrating a new energy is this kind of evolutionary process, and those go slow.
And also that these squares are both waning squares. So you know, we're coming to an end. And I think when it's a waning square, there's a little bit more of a feeling of like, okay, what are the things we messed up? This is our last chance to maybe make good, but is it too late to make good? And there isn't that same enthusiasm as the first square where we're like, gung ho, yeah, off we go. And I think that's part of it, you know, that both of them are waning squares of different cycles. And I think, you know, there's so many cycles that are coming together. And really, I think, you know, I always go back to this, but the big changes started with the Uranus-Pluto square, 2012 to 2015. And if we had made some changes then, that would have been, you know, maybe for a collective improvement, we would be in a little bit of a different situation now. So we're kind of really in the stew now because we didn't want to make changes. We didn't want to make changes to our financial institutions, to our educational institutions, to our healthcare, to anything. And this is global, not just in the US. So not to mention things like marginalization, like racism, like homophobia, like transphobia, all of those issues. And so now they're coming up because we've squashed them down under the carpet for too long. So I think we're really, and we feel the pressure with those squares to resolve things, you know, to resolve things before the next cycle. And that's a lot of pressure. And I think something you were saying, Christopher, you know, the pressure to kind of during lockdown to produce 10 books or write a song at least, or the next opera or whatever, you know, it's like, when really what a lot of us just want to do is put our feet up and, you know, make a jigsaw or make sourdough bread. I was looking enviously at people making sourdough bread in the first lockdown. I was so busy out of my gills between astrology and psychotherapy. And I was thinking, I'd love to make sourdough. Never wanted to bake in my life. And suddenly, you know, I want to make sourdough bread because everyone seems to be doing it. So I think there is, you know, these are just some of the things that are happening with everything that's going on. And I think, how can we allow those different parts of us, and how can we make space for the people we love when sometimes there isn't a lot of physical space to do that in? Or if we're on our own, what do we do with the lack of mirroring, you know? And, you know, as a friend and I were saying once, we might come out of this being completely feral because we have no idea how to be social. So it doesn't matter, you know, what the situation is, it's challenging, you know, one way or the other. And I think maybe that's the message to get out there. You're not going crazy if you're struggling at the moment. And, you know, good job if you're managing to hold on any relationship really of any kind. And because it's challenging. So find ways to discover some ways to self-soothe with your moon, to find comfort, to connect with friends, and to have, and really to stay grounded. That's a really important thing with, you know, and I know you work as a healer, Rachel, so no doubt you're telling people left, right, and center, but to really stay grounded on a daily basis, you know, in our body and nature in whatever way we can, because otherwise we're kind of just spinning. And it's so easy to become very intellectual about something that is affecting us on a very, on really a very human, emotional, and physical level.
So well said, Margaret. And can I want to just say, since we're talking about waning squares, that our hour is coming up. We have 5 minutes. So Christopher, you say what you were going to say, and then also I just wanted to remind anybody, if they have any questions, please send them into the chat. We'll stay for a few minutes and answer any questions that you have. Go ahead, Christopher.
I think we've seen a lot of, I love waning square. I love, Rachel and I are both like seizing on the square thing, you know. I love the idea of the waning square because acceptance can come with fatigue.
Yeah.
You know, that you're so tired of having that same fight over and over and over again, that actually there can be an acceptance that comes from it. And a lot of times, sometimes people can associate acceptance with defeat, especially when there's a square energy going on. But there's also this thing where you're so fatigued. And I think it's something that we kind of saw where, you know, like for instance, with the invasion of the Capitol or whatever, it's like, it's the last gasp, it's the last holding on to, you know, this is the way it's going to be, you know. And then there's also this kind of like, okay, my kid's trans, like, next idea, you know, I mean, you know, so there's so many of these things that are going on that are dramatic, but kind of like don't become a big deal, you know. I mean, so there's something to be said, I guess there's something to be said for the waning square, where I think it's just, you know, looking at it as an older person, you know, the things that used to bother me just like don't bother me, and there's actually a delight in it not, you know, bothering me anymore. So there's a kind of acceptance that I think can come from that sort of fatigue of the waning square.
Right. It's kind of like finally putting the tantruming children to bed. Back to our metaphor of sleep, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We have a question. What do we think about the partile conjunction between Uranus and Mars on the 20th with the Biden inauguration, or Biden taking the presidency?
I'm not a mundane astrologer, so I'm not even going to go near that one.
Armand, it looks like you have a thought.
Yeah, Armand.
It's not. I mean, it's not a great aspect to have. I mean, to have the god of war mixing with Uranus as the sun. You know, the wonderful thing about Inauguration Day, when they moved it to January 20th, they assured that almost, I think about 24 out of 25 times, it will land in Aquarius. It's sort of right on the cusp. You have the sun in Aquarius, right at the very beginning of Aquarius, and all the other planets that are there, and then you have Mars and Uranus meeting in Taurus. It's a volatile aspect, is what it is. It's a very volatile aspect, and the moon is void. The moon is void. I'm not exactly sure what time the inauguration is, but if I'm correct, the moon will be void, of course, which is perhaps the best news. It's not great for the Biden presidency, I guess, but it's as far as the best news you could have, I guess, that moon void. It's a very volatile aspect, and Donald Trump is such a very martial person, you know, that if you wanted to sort of personify things a little bit, you could really make a story. But we'll have to wait and see, you know.
Well, I was thinking, at least on one level, we already are seeing the marshaling of military forces around the Capitol in preparation, which I think is part of an expression of it.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point. And, you know, speaking to Donald Trump and Mars, you know, that morning might be when he decides to resign and have Pence pardon him, just so he can upstage Biden's inauguration.
We should put money on that.
That's the headline.
Strategy, Christopher. Wow.
Yeah.
If we don't have any more questions, we've kind of come to the end of our time, and we do put blogs up every day on our Facebook page. We have our website, www.relationshipsandastrology.com. There's lots of information about each individual as well, and about our courses. And we are planning to set up a membership scheme soon. So thank you everyone so much for coming and joining us this evening. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Be well, sleep well.